Welcome back to another web development video where I show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video we're going to use CSS Grid again to make this sort of jagged little column layout. It has this nice thick border kind of delineating all the paragraphs, and then all the paragraphs are sort of this, they're uniform, you can't really see it, but they're uniform styles, but they're all jagged, not just ragged left, but they have a hard left edge and a real ragged right edge, so it's sort of a unique layout. And we are going to use this only CSS and HTML to make this happen. So let's go over and let's start putting it all together. Everything set up here. We'll start with a mobile view. Always good to do mobile first layouts. It just makes everything a lot easier. So we have 1, 2, 3 paragraphs here, and then this one has a few more paragraphs. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and we can do this a few different ways, but I'm going to go ahead and make this 3 columns. And then inside each column I'm actually going to have a little subgrid. So with CSS Grid you can actually put grids inside of grids. So I'll show you how to do that, and we'll wind up with something responsive that also, you know, flows pretty well with a mobile layout. So the first thing that we need is our overarching grid for our 3 columns. We're not going to work with this until the end, and then there are going to be 3 items. So there's a grid, 3 grid items, and these are going to be our 3 columns. So this is grid item 1, 2, and 3. And then for each of our grid items, we're going to have a subgrid inside of there with however many elements that we want. So we're just going to come and put that subgrid on all 3 of our elements. To select multiple elements at the same time, you just hold down Control or I suppose Command on an Apple computer. I don't know what it is, but on PC it's Control and click, and you can select multiple items. And then under our subgrid, I'm just going to put 3 items. Let's call them subgrid items. And I'm actually going to select all these and make them paragraphs, because you can see that they're all paragraphs here, and a paragraph is a block level element, so better to be more specific with your HTML5 tags than to just be putting divs all over the place. I already have a div here, I have a div here. This could be a section, you could call that a section, you could call this even an article. So we could really sort of do these things, and then this subgrid is really just something for structure. So I don't mind using a div for that because it doesn't have a lot of semantic meaning. So this is the way we're going to structure our grid with our subgrid. Okay, and so now we need to create a few different classes here. We need one to be blue, one to be red, one to be green, and we're going to tag that to our subgrid items. Okay, so each item is going to have a specific color, so blue, red, green. And then the second column is red, blue, red, green. And we can add elements here, so it's not a big deal that we have multiple elements. You know that we have 4 here and only 3 here. It's not a big deal. And then we have 4 here too, so green, blue, red, and green. So we'll make sure that our grid is is responsive in a way that we can add as many elements as we want into our subgrid, and then it'll place all of our elements in the right way. Okay, so we have all of our elements laid out. We need some content, and we'll go to the Meaningful Ipsum side. If you've watched some of my tutorials in the past, this is a project that I do where it's just first chapters from famous stories. So if you don't want to use lorem ipsum text and you want to use real text, we have all these different first chapters from famous stories that you can use. And I'm just going to take Alice in Wonderland and just put my content up here. Since these are paragraphs, we can just put them right out to the side. I'm using Jagged. What used to be called Jagged is now called Pug, and it's basically just a preprocessor for HTML, sort of like you could use Haml, or you could use a few different preprocessors for your HTML. It's a lot like SAS, works in the same way. And if you want to know more about it, you can go to pug.js and just sort of look that up online, and you'll be able to find information about how to add it to your project from the command line, or you can introduce it using gulp. I often will use gulp, but inside of Codepen they actually have it, so you can choose to use it. If you don't want to use that and you just want to use regular HTML, you just go here to your HTML preprocessor and just choose none, and then you'll be shown the regular. You can just set up regular HTML. You can see that it's not reading it because I don't have all the HTML tags. So whenever you choose Pug again, then it comes back. And if you ever want to see the compiled HTML, then you can see it here. You can see that it's just, my code is just coming down, and this is what it looks like in the HTML. So some people have mentioned that they have a little bit of a hard time with that, but because you can go back and forth between the HTML, I don't have a real problem with using this for tutorials. And we're just filling out our content right now. So this is going to be all of our paragraphs. And here's the last paragraph. Okay. Alright, so we have all of our content here. You can see here that it's it looks like it's just one big long paragraph of text. And so we need to start styling these individual colors. Okay. So let's start with red. Seems easy. So we're going to say border left of I think I settled on 7 pixels and solid, and we're just going to call this one red. And so now you can see all of our red paragraphs have a red border. And let's go ahead and set our blue, and then instead of red we're going to say deep sky blue. I looked that color up before, so you can see that it's not just a regular blue, it's deep sky blue, so I looked that up. And the last one is green, and we're not going to go with just regular green, we're going to go with forest green, which is a little bit different than the regular green, a little bit darker, not quite as in your face. Alright, so we have all of our paragraphs, and they have their little borders to the left, and you can make those borders as wide or as thick as you want by changing this value here. And what we need to do is create a little bit of space. So all of these are called SubGrid item. So let's just look at our SubGrid item. And we'll just say padding to the left of, let's say like 0.3 rem, something like that. That seems fine to me. It doesn't require a lot of space. You can see there's not a ton of space here, but just kind of a uniform space for the text. We don't need that anymore. So This lays out really well. It has all the things that we need, all the things that we're looking for at least. And the next part is going to be deciding on the subgrid structure. We'll worry about the larger grid as we get out to larger sizes, but even at a small size I want to get this these gaps. So I'm going to choose just to do a 12 column grid because I can see that there's some little inconsistencies. If I do a 3 column grid, then you can see that there's not very much space here. It looks to me like it's on some sort of 8 or 12 column grid here. So I'm just going to do 12. And so we say subgrid is going to be display grid, and then the grid template columns is going to be repeat 12 1 FR. Alright, so you can see here that each of our grids is being laid out, each of our subgrids is being laid out with as much space as they can have. If you notice, each of these is at the same place based on its color. So we can actually, you can see that the red is flush to the left and it's got a little bit of space left to the right. It does the same thing here. So each of these colors is actually bound to sort of the same layout structure, and the green is too. It's not as far over as the blue, but it goes all the way to the edge. So we are going to attach our column structure, and the way that we get our column spacing, we're going to attach that to each color. Before I kind of tried to do, I thought it was all different, but as I got into it I realized that each of these colors is represented by basically the same grid structure, which makes this super easy to be able to lay out. So anytime you want to add a column that starts flush left and goes not quite all the way to the right, you would just add the red class, and then it gives you this red paragraph. Alright, I hope that makes some sense. And what we're going to do is, let's start with the blue because that's the first one. And it looks to me like the blue one starts halfway, about halfway. And so I'm going to say grid column is, because we have a 12 column grid, I'm going to start it at, we're going to just start it at 6, and we're going to say span all. And so now our first one starts halfway, and then it spans the rest of the width of our grid. We could even, it looks to me like it's more like 5, so let's start it with 5 and see how that goes. It looks bad here because we need to straighten everything else up. And then for our red is going to start at grid line 1 and go to maybe 9, 10, 11, something like that. We'll just kind of feel it. So our red is going to start at 1, and it's not going to span all because you see there's some column space here that's not being taken up. So that's why I think it should be 1 to like 10, something like that. Okay, and then we got to do our green, otherwise we're not going to see that very well. And then our green doesn't start as far over as this, so it won't be 5. So we'll try something like 2 or 3, and then it's actually going to go the full width of the column. So you can see that the green goes as far, almost as far as the blue, about as far as the blue. So we're going to start our green at column, let's start it at column 3, maybe 2, 3. Let's start it at column 3, and then we're going to have it span all. And so it will go all the way. So you can see that our blue is the farthest over, our green is the next farthest, and then the red starts at the left, but it leaves some gap here. And it does it all the way down. You might like this, how it's sort of this space in between your paragraphs. That's not what we have in our design. Our design has all the paragraphs right up next to each other. So we'll just come up to our subgrid items and we'll take away the margin. We'll say margin of 0, and then that brings everything up because P tags, our P tags here have some built-in margin that the browser gives it. So we have to tell it specifically no margin. So now we're pretty close to being there, at least on the mobile device. You can see that all of our paragraphs are being taken care of here. This one gets a little weird because we just need different colors. If we put two colors right next to each other, they're just going to line up like that. So if we do a red one here, maybe, so we come down where it says down, down, down. If we do red, maybe that would be okay. And so you can see that it's going to pull all of our content over to the left like that. Or we could even do blue, red, green seems to be a nice pattern. And then we have red, blue, red, and then we have green, red, blue, and then we have red and green. So you can just sort of decide how those things are going to be. You can see that as we stretch out our column structure, that our columns, because they're 1FR, it's going to take up one fraction, or essentially it's going to divide the space between here and here by 12. So that's what this means. So it's going to divide it by 12, and then each of those divisions is going to be equal spaced. So as you get here, you can see that our columns tighten up just a little bit. But as we go out here, you can see there's a much bigger gap here. So you can decide to deal with that in the in-betweens. If you want to tighten these things up and you want to kind of pull everything over to the left a little bit, you could do that. I'm not going to do that or worry about that right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to worry about at 700 pixels, we're going to change our overarching grid structure to our 3-column grid. And the way that we would do that is we come up here and we would just put a media query. So at media and a minimum width of 700 pixels, we're going to call our grid, and we're going to make it a display grid. And then we'll make our grid template columns 3. We'll say repeat 3 and 1FR. And so now at smaller sizes we have our one column, and then at larger sizes we have our 3-column layout. And you could adjust these. Obviously we're getting a lot of strangeness here because of the size of our paragraphs. So if you wanted to cut that down a little bit, you would just need to be pretty wary and cognizant of how long your paragraphs are. So this is just sort of a long sentence. You could cut some of these things down and then cut down the size of your final things over here. We could even take one of these out to try to even up our paragraphs. This down, down, down. That's really cramping our style a little bit. So with a magazine, in order to get these nice layouts, they're controlling how much text is there. So once you come out this way, you can see that it sort of evens up when you get out to this size. And what I want to do is I want to put finally just sort of a gap in between them. They're a little bit too close. So on our big grid, our 3-column grid, we're going to put a little grid gap. And the grid gap controls the space between columns and the space between rows. So I'm going to say a grid gap of 1 rem, and you can see that it's causing no space here because we have our margins, but it is causing some space between our columns, which is exactly what we want. If you were to somehow get some space here, you could call just grid column gap, and it only controls the spacing between the columns, so the verticals, the spacing between each of the columns. And then if you wanted to control the row spacing, so the space between each row in your grid, you could call grid row gap, and then that would control each of those independently. Sometimes you don't want an even gap between your columns and your rows. So that's how you deal with that. And the very last thing is I want to put a max width of 1000 pixels, and then we say margin auto, and all that does is once we get to 1000 pixels it stops growing, and then we have our nice sort of strange layout here. You're getting some interesting things here, and some interesting things here, and if you wanted to recontrol how some of these things are configured, or if you just want to go through and change how, like where they start, you could say, you know, if we wanted this to pull over a little bit, we could pull it over a little bit, and it starts not quite so far to the middle, and this one not quite so far to the middle, and so you could kind of pull them up and bring them a little bit closer like that. So you can see how this might be laid out. Maybe you want to change this one to a green, so you get a little bit different styling down here, and sort of pull them together, or maybe create some interesting things that are going on inside the text. But you can see that we've essentially created a similar layout to this magazine layout based on using CSS Grid Layout. And so when we get to a mobile size, that's what it looks like, and when we go out to a larger size, that's what it looks like here. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments section below. I'm happy to answer them as quickly as I can, and hopefully this is really informative tutorial. This would obviously be for a page or a section in a blog or a magazine, or it could even be on a brochure type website. But hopefully you take these principles of being able to lay out things in a jagged column and be able to apply those to your specific situation. If you don't know very much about Grid, you can go back and I have a whole playlist on CSS Grid and sort of the basics. And if you want more layouts in that CSS Grid playlist, I also have some more layout videos where I show you how to do some different column structures in an overarching way. You can follow me on Twitter at Brian Heiferkamp, and yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.